es la doctora Marit Brommer, quien cuenta con más de 20 años de experiencia en la industria energética, ejecutando proyectos de exploración y producción de hidrocarburos y geotermia. Ahora dirige la Asociación Internacional de Geotermia, que apoya la geotermia en todo el mundo. Los intereses específicos de esta asociación son la de recaudación de fondos para proyectos de la energía geotérmica, desde soluciones modulares a pequeña escala fuera de la red, tanto para energía como para la utilización directa de los recursos geotérmicos, y la creación de asociaciones eficaces que se centren en la creación de la capacidad en el tema de hidrógeno verde geotérmico. Los primeros ejemplos se encuentran en Nueva Zelanda e Islandia, y la doctora Brommer está convencida de que la región latinoamericana sería un excelente trampolín para nuevos proyectos exitosos. Le damos la bienvenida y también saludamos al ingeniero Luis Guillermo Acosta, director ejecutivo de ACIPET, quien moderará este espacio. Recuerden que a partir de este momento, este espacio será totalmente en inglés. Esperamos sus preguntas y comentarios en el chat habilitado en Zoom y en YouTube. Marit, thank you for being here, and go ahead, engineer. Welcome, everyone.
Marit, welcome aboard to ACIPET, the Colombian Association of Petroleum Engineers. We're extremely delighted to have you here with us. I think we're going to have a great conversation. There are a lot of people looking forward for this conversation. So the methodology that we're going to have is that basically going to greet and salute the petroleum engineers as we move forward. And we're going to go through the questions spontaneously as basically we move through the Coffee with Energy and Leadership from ACIPET. So welcome aboard, Marit. We're delighted to have you here, and welcome to ACIPET once again.
Super. Well, thank you, Engineer Luis. It is such an honor to be invited on the very early morning coffee show, Energy, Coffee and Leadership. For me, it's a pleasure to talk geothermal, of course, and even more so within the Colombia space, within the hydrocarbon space. And yeah, I'm excited for this coming, let's say, 30 to 40 minutes, and dive deep into what geothermal can bring to the country and the world.
Awesome. Thank you, Marit. Well, and now as promised, I will switch to Spanish. Bienvenidos a todos los ingenieros de petróleo de Colombia y a todos los profesionales afines. Y bienvenidos también a aquellos profesionales que nos están escuchando en otras partes del mundo a través de YouTube, no necesariamente a través de este Zoom. Voy a ir saludando poco a poco, como es la metodología habitual. Inicio con un saludo especial para los 5 primeros que veo acá en la lista, para los ingenieros Adriana Mantilla, Alejandro Espina, Alejandro Restrepo, Carlos Augusto Rangel y Carlos Escandón. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá con nosotros. A medida que vayamos avanzando, voy a ir saludando el resto de ingenieros y pues me alegra mucho que nos estemos muy acompañados. Vamos adelante y tenemos tengo un buen set de preguntas en la mente para Marit, pero si escuchamos preguntas por parte de ustedes o vemos preguntas en el WhatsApp que sean apropiadas y que podamos traducir y hacer en forma muy dinámica el evento, pues claro que sí van a entrar en las preguntas para Marit. Entonces, bienvenidos a Café con Energía y Liderazgo. Bienvenida, Marit, a un Café con Energía y Liderazgo de ACIPET. Bienvenida a Colombia a través de las redes y estamos listos para comenzar. Marit, okay, I think we're ready to get going, okay?
Super.
Finally, so, well, just tell us a little bit more about how you decided to move to geothermal. When did you have the first experience with geothermal potential energy? What were you working on? What did basically bring you to this exciting area of technology?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that I think brings out the best of both worlds. As you can all read, and maybe the ones who have seen me operating as well outside the IGA, when it comes down to giving presentations, I always speak very firmly and candidly about where I come from and where I stand for. And I'm a geologist, Luis. I'm a geologist, and I am trained and sort of professionalized my whole career about hydrocarbons. And I have a PhD in geophysics, and after that I went into operations and I worked for the majors in big oil, so to speak. And I have enjoyed every minute of that type of work. And at the same time, I guess gradually but steadily, there was this sort of notion that energy transition and what we can do when we use our skills, our wisdom, and our capacities and capabilities wisely, we could do so much more than, in a very harsh way, just produce oil and gas from the many resources that we have beneath our feet. And I guess that notion sort of stood firmly when I decided basically to jump ship and exited from a very nice, lovely career in oil to take up the helm of a non-profit association as IGA and become the more, let's say, the more ambassador and more the focal person for geothermal. To me, of course, wind and solar, these are all beautiful technologies, and I wholeheartedly embrace them as a space in the energy transition. But for me as a geologist and for me as a subsurface professional, subsurface, let's say, addict, if you like, there is only one real technology that can also help drive major changes in that energy transition, and that's geothermal. That is what we have in our subsurface. And I came to the realization that besides our limited club, if you like, of subsurface, other professionals, no one has heard of geothermal. And I guess that was for me the decisive moment to not only utilize my knowledge, my skills, and my understanding of how the world works when it runs on fossil fuels, hence from the subsurface point of view, and translate that with a communicative approach towards embracing geothermal as part, and not just as a part, but as a significant portion of the energy transition that will come to all of our countries around the world.
Wow. Okay. And we have seen that it only not comes from the knowledge, but also from the heart, right? Loving geothermal is something that you promote in all your interviews and presentations, and that is great. And I think we're going to adapt this to a Love Petroleum Engineer from the ACP now on.
Do that.
If we may.
Yes, for sure. No, I think, Louisa, just to answer very briefly, because I think you point on something important that as a technical person, as an engineer, not everyone is fully aware of sometimes, is that we are passionate about our engineering capacity and capabilities. We love it when we see things coming into fruition, or when we produce the right type of fluid from the right type of whatever. I mean, we get excited, but the general public, but also our politicians, don't necessarily love the same nerdy stuff. And hence, I think it's our common role all over the world to come together and promote our love for the subsurface from an emotional point of view. And how we exactly do that is cultural, and it is diverse from country to country. It will range in terms of, and it will diverse from how you promote that love. But I think it is crucial, as you quite rightly said, that you address the emotional aspect of our work. And that will buy in a larger portion of our societies to support our work. And that is equally true for hydrocarbons as it is for geothermal, because we share a lot of the technologies.
Absolutely. Awesome. So I'll continue with the salute as promised. I'm going to switch to Spanish. Bueno, continuando con los saludos, como lo he prometido, un saludo muy especial para Carlos Hernando Candela de la Junta Directiva de ACIPET, y aprovecho para saludar a toda la Junta Directiva y a su presidente Carlos Leal. Tenemos también al ingeniero Carlos Pastrana, al ingeniero Daniel Vargas, a Daniel Girasoli, a Diana Cero, a la ingeniera Diana Garzón, y un momento que estoy mirando acá el listado, y al ingeniero Fabio Guerrero. Ya en la siguiente pregunta vamos a saludar el resto de ingenieros que están presentes en este chat. Obviamente, desafortunadamente no tengo acceso a los que están por YouTube, pero un saludo muy especial para todos. Y también al ingeniero Guillermo Quintanilla desde Canadá nos saludas por el chat. Guillermo, bienvenido también a un café con energía de liderazgo de ACP. Bueno, entonces entremos en materia. Okay, Marit, we're going to get into business here. How much technical knowledge is right now worldwide in terms of research in geothermal energy? Is there enough? Are we still in a transition phase, in phase one? where are we worldwide in geothermal energy potential research and investigation?
Yeah, this is a very good point. So look, I think when you look at it from, and let's talk some numbers first, and then we can, let's say, move on to your big question behind the question, and that is, are we doing enough to utilize that potential? When we look at geothermal, we're doing two main things, basically. We're producing electricity, and we're using geothermal directly in the form of that heat. For direct use opportunities for greenhouses, for industries, for cities, for district heating. Now, if I look at the two things as our two main, let's say, services, electricity, we have at the moment, 2023, we have around 17 gigawatt installed capacity around the world, coming from let's say 10 major countries. 10 major countries have, let's say, installed capacities of more than 800 to 900 megawatt. And there is only a handful of countries that have reached the 1 gigawatt club, as we call them. When we're looking at heating and cooling to a certain degree, but predominantly heating, we have around 120 gigawatt thermal. So this is the thermal capacity installed around servicing cities, the greenhouse sector, and light industry needs. China is the most dominant country for, just as a sideway, but China is the most, let's say, dominant country when it comes down to heating. And they have really embarked on a journey the past 5 years in order to phase out, for a certain degree, coal, because coal is one of the most polluting, let's say, fossil fuel agents, especially in inner cities. If we talk about the potential, there are some studies, and we have helped to put these studies together, is that we haven't even scratched the surface of utilizing that enormous potential of geothermal. We have, on average, for electricity, we scratched the surface of about 5%. So we have a lot of potential, but we've only and basically utilized 5% of that potential in that sort of 17 to almost 20 gigawatt. That's what we are going forward to for electricity. And in terms of heat, the chances, the opportunities, the breadth of opportunities for geothermal for heating and cooling is just so gigantic. We are in the minor percentages in terms of utilization of that potential, because using geothermal directly is opening up the geological, let's say, borders. Because electricity is predominantly made out of the volcanic areas, such as Iceland and New Zealand and Kenya in their rifting systems, but also in Central America, where you see these beautiful Central American volcanic islands really tapping into that sort of electricity-based geothermal resources. But heating, you can go to much lower degrees of Celsius or Fahrenheit. I talk Celsius. It can range from 40 to 50 Celsius all the way to maybe 120. And you can service an industry, a city, and a greenhouse. And you can move from volcanics to sedimentary basins. And this is exactly where the building bridges sort of notion comes from. We are not geographically, neither geological tied to specific hot regions, as in volcanics. We can be everywhere.
Wow, that's amazing. Marit, I was thinking as you were talking about this potential, is there basically a one-on-one paper that you can refer to us, and we'll send it to the engineers after this Café con Energía? Because I think that there's a lot of information and data and numbers that we would like to know. So if you can send us a one-on-one paper, a very basic paper of what is geothermal energy, we would love to publish that in all other websites from ACIPET.
Fantastic. Let's do that. Let's make that sort of an infographic for geothermal, and then the numbers, but also because I like what you ask here, because the question is really, how much further can we grow, and how much further can we utilize that geothermal resource? So yes, I like that. Will do. It will be in English, Mr. Luis, so I hope that's fine.
Not a problem. I think most of our engineers in Colombia are bilingual. Not to say 100%, because that's the nature of our business.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll continue with the salute. Bueno, ingenieros, continúo con los saludos a los ingenieros de petróleos y profesionales afines que nos acompañan, al ingeniero Fernando Guaje, al ingeniero Guillermo Rugeles, siempre gran participante de todos nuestros eventos, a Ian Bywott, welcome aboard, a Julián López, al ingeniero Julián Ortiz, y a la ingeniera Marta Villarreal de nuestra junta directiva. Bienvenidos a todos y muchas gracias por estar con ACIPET en esta conversación tan supremamente interesante sobre el potencial de la energía geotermal con la doctora Marit Brommer, una autoridad en el tema a nivel mundial. Marit, let's continue with the next question that I think is something that is very common. What's the significance of a geothermal potential in this worldwide energy transition? How does it fit? I think it perfectly fits, but I would like to hear from you. How does it fit in the energy transition that we're going through worldwide?
Yeah. Yes. Look, I think this is indeed a global question, and we can break it down towards how it can also help to transition, let's say, regions and hence countries. Because if you look at what the world is faced at, and I guess it's everywhere in the news all over the world, is that we are, of course, faced with the adverse impacts of climate change, and hence a lot of focus of industries, governments, but also companies and individuals are on battling that sort of adverse impacts of climate change through reducing the emissions, CO2 emissions, methane emissions, all kinds of emissions. And the hardest target is, of course, our energy system, because let's be honest, we have developed ourselves in terms of who we are as human beings, and especially after the Industrial Revolution, since we capitalized on fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. And fossil fuels seen as the main culprit and as the main, let's say, target to get into reducing their emissions. This is where geothermal, this is where wind, solar, this is where the exciting discussions around the energy transition in general take place. Reducing CO2 emissions, reducing fossil fuel emissions, reducing, let's say, that impact factor, and hence, how can we balance the change? How can we transform our very lucrative, productive, but also super efficient energy system towards a new one? And that takes time, and that we need all hands on deck and all aboard is crystal clear, I guess, to the entire world. However, I think the shift in discussions has been predominantly driven by utility companies who are targeting electricity first, and then maybe other uses of, let's say, energy second. And hence the focus has been over the past 2 decades predominantly on seeing the rise of wind and solar to change the electricity-driven supply chain from fossil fuels to a new form of energy, basically coming from the technologies wind and solar. Geothermal has played a very small but still interesting role in that sort of electricity game because of countries such as Kenya, such as El Salvador, such as Iceland, where the majority of the renewables comes from geothermal, and the majority of the people get renewable green-based electricity through geothermal. So we are not insignificant for certain countries, but we are very small compared to renewable electricity and driving down those CO2 emissions from fossil fuels in the worldwide stats. As I said, 70 gigawatt electric. On average, wind farms these days get procured for around 8 to 10 gigawatt. 8 to 10 gigawatt installed offshore platforms versus us 17 gigawatt worldwide as geothermal. And I guess that has skewed the conversation a little bit towards geothermal being seen as a category called other, or basically grouped as a category of not being really visible and hence being not playing its role. The second part of this question is about where does geothermal fit in direct use, as in heating and cooling. And there we see that we play at least a bigger part. But we also see that it is harder. It is the elephant in the room, because heating and cooling is a molecule that is not even, let's say, that's not commoditized yet as being part of the energy transition. So gas is a commodity, basically, that is being traded all over the world via LNG, via pipelines. It is very geopolitical sensitive, of course. And gas is the predominant driver for electricity to certain degrees, but also for heating up homes, doing industry and industrial efforts and processes, and basically growing tomatoes in greenhouses. So we are seeing in the thermal side of the energy transition also a little bit competition between our fossil fuel friends. And this is where building the bridges and understanding where infrastructure versus supply chain meets each other. That geothermal has a potential to overcome these barriers because it's local, it provides energy security, it has a base load factor, both for the electricity grid as the infrastructure needed to decarbonize industry, decarbonize heating and cooling systems in cities and other types of works, is evident, it's clear. But how exactly that will fit in an energy transition space is something that we really have to talk about more openly than we're currently doing.
Oh, definitely, Marit. Wow, I'm learning a lot myself with all these questions. So thank you so much. I'm going to continue with the greetings. Bienvenido al ingeniero Mauricio Klopatowski y bienvenido a una ingeniera muy especial, very special engineer, Nancy Vidal, que fue la promotora de la reunión con Marit Brommer y ACIPET acá en Colombia. Bienvenida, ingeniera Nancy. Y también Nancy fue miembro de la junta directiva pasada de ACIPET, entonces estamos muy complacidos de tenerte acá con nosotros. Igualmente al ingeniero Oscar Díaz. Así no sé cuál de los dos Oscar es, pero hay un Oscar Díaz que fue el presidente de ACIPET de la pasada junta directiva. Bienvenido, ingeniero Oscar. Y si es el otro ingeniero Oscar Díaz, también bienvenido a ACIPET, a un café con energía y liderazgo. Bienvenido a Pedro Gómez, a Sonia López y al ingeniero Uriel Suaza, miembro de la junta directiva actual de ACIPET y miembro de la junta pasada. Entonces, bienvenidos a todos. Estamos muy complacidos de estar acá con ustedes. Me faltan dos ingenieros, voy a terminar de una vez la lista. Bienvenido al ingeniero Wilson Largo, qué bueno tenerte acá con nosotros, Wilson, y a Jamie Gamba. Muchas gracias a todos los ingenieros y profesionales afines acá presentes. Obviamente se corre el riesgo de dejar a alguien por fuera, pero no es por voluntad. Pero muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este Zoom. A los ingenieros que están en YouTube, pues bienvenidos también y estar acompañándonos acá en un café con energía y liderazgo. Vuelvo entonces donde Marit con las preguntas. Marit, something that is coming like very obvious, but definitely we would like to know a little more about the quantification. And it's basically the environmental benefits from this geothermal energy that nowadays that is very something that is very popular in terms of energy transition. Tell us, what are the environmental benefits from the geothermal energy use?
So if you compare on average, let's take a diesel generator on a very lovely island somewhere on our planet, because a lot of islands, a lot of remote communities are being fed through diesel generating electricity efforts. And if you would replace that with a geothermal power plant, you would not only, let's say, localize its energy form, and we have a very small imprint on that matter, because we have a very, let's say, compared to other technologies, we have a very small footprint of our assets. We drill a well, as we all know in hydrocarbons as well. And after the drilling is over, we have a very small, let's say, a power plant that sits there and is producing electricity to a grid or to a standalone unit. But I think the real win in geothermal, if you compare it to our friends from the fossil fuel-based industry, is that we have virtually zero CO2 emissions. And yes, it changes from geology to geology. Look, Luis, I'm a geologist, so I have to say this. I mean, if you produce from a volcanic region or if you produce from a carbonate region, it makes a small difference in terms of our producing CO2 emissions per unit volume. But if you compare that unit volume towards other type of technologies, including fossil fuel, but also to our wind and solar friends, we are almost equally, because our supply chain is so local. We are not being fed through critical minerals, so actually, we're producing critical minerals. We're producing in our brines critical minerals that we can also use for the energy transition. So the environmental benefits are target number one, reducing CO2 emissions by using geothermal. If you then look at what geothermal can do, is having a very small footprint, is producing at a very low carbon base load electricity 24/7, no need for batteries, no need for, let's say, hoping that the weather stays very nicely and sunny and windy. We are always on. We are always on, meaning that our capacity factor per installed megawatt is phenomenal. We have a 96% installed capacity factor. Versus, and this is not to bash the other technologies, but let's be honest, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So their capacity factors is on average between 30 and 40%. We are doubling that very, very easily. And hence, if you just simply look at the geothermal power plant with all that assets, very low environmental, let's say, impact, high environmental benefits when it comes down to CO2 reductions versus others, and a 24/7, let's say, production profile. What's not to love, Luis? What's not to love about geothermal?
Wow. Okay. All right. Marit, we have a very good question from one of our audience, from Diana Acero. I believe you know her.
Yes.
And it says over here the questions that she wrote it in English, so it's going to be much easier. Hi, Marit. It's always a pleasure listening to you talking about geothermal. You have seen many regions developing geothermal successfully. Regions with similar setups as Colombia and Latin America in general. What do you think Latin America is doing well currently, and how can we do better to boost geothermal development in a region? That's an excellent question. Thank you, Diana.
So, buenos dias, Diana. It's so nice to get your question, and I hope you're well and fine. Excellent question. Look, I think what the Latin American countries, and I consider this not to be within the Central American countries, because they have capitalized on their volcanic regions already, and they have installed capacity. So the Central American countries have done their homework pretty well over the past 3-4 decades, and they have installed geothermal capacity. The beauty of the Latin American countries, especially in the Southern America continent, is, and I think what is exciting in Colombia as well, is that you see a mix of societal gains, and hence a very strong political will to renewables, for greening up society, for phasing out to a certain degree fossil fuels and replacing it with geothermal. So that is what the Latin American countries are doing exceedingly well in terms of strong government and political will, putting the right instruments in place in order to facilitate the dialogue. And what I think is happening within, let's say, especially in the more, let's say, protruding environments, such as Chile and Argentina to a certain degree as well, but especially Chile and the whole Andes region, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, you see that more and more industry comes together with government in order to make decisive actions on becoming key players in geothermal, both from a mining industry sector, from the oil and gas sector, but also from a community-based approach towards allowing greener energy to be part of their energy mix. And you need that. You need strong political will in combination with a strong industry. What I've seen so far in Colombia, and yes, call me biased, but what I've seen so far in Colombia is that there is an extremely knowledgeable industry called the hydrocarbon industry, with good associations such as ACIPET, who are leading the thought change as well that is needed. In combination, you have a strong political partner here in the Ministry of Mines, who wants geothermal to happen. That's a golden combination. At the same time, I think what is needed now is to do the first project really well, and to do that with all the benefits that we just spoke about, and to explain to the public, explain to society, and explain also to your constituents, as in the geologists coming from, let's say, hydrocarbons, the government officials who want to embrace green and clean, that geothermal works, and that it works well, and it can be replicated over and over again to go down in CO2 and to ramp up electricity and heating and cooling. So that's the golden, let's say, situation I guess you have in Colombia. And now it's time to go to execution, as in doing that first project really well.
Okay, awesome, Marit. Thank you, Diana, for the question. I'll continue with the greetings. I see here, perdón, continúo con el saludo. Está Alejandra Espina, bienvenido. Bienvenida, Alejandra. Está Carlos Arocha, el ingeniero Carlos Arocha, de perforación y completamiento. Bienvenido, Carlos. Veo también a Cristóbal Fernández Salgado, que no lo había saludado antes. Y bueno, creo que había saludado al resto de personas acá. Como dije anteriormente, si en algún momento no saludo a alguien, eso es de forma involuntaria, porque el listado va cambiando y no me entran en el orden alfabético desde un principio, como es igual. Entonces, a veces bajo hasta el final del listado y no puedo saludar a todo el mundo. Bienvenido, Alexis García. Creo que no te había saludado. Y vamos con una pregunta muy buena de la ingeniera Mantilla. We have a very good question from Adriana Mantilla here, Marit.
Yeah.
Basically, and well, I'm going to read it all. I think we have the time, and I can give you a little bit more of the context. We have huge geothermal resources in the volcanic chain, Central Cordillera, but also in the sedimentary basins where there are a lot of geological and geophysical data from the oil and gas industry in Colombia. The question is how the Colombian regulatory framework can be built or improved to promote geothermal development following the role models as El Salvador, Iceland, US, Japan, etc. That's a question from Adriana Mantilla. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, super question. I mean, without good regulatory frameworks or even the legal framework, it will be difficult for geothermal to be tapped into. And yes, to the huge potential in the Cordillera. And I have had the pleasure as well to visit one of the potential sites when I was there the last time in Colombia. And not only is it very beautiful, also I think from a geological point of view, I think that's the right spot to go into and do it really well. The electricity off-taker in Colombia, it's at least the ones that I have been talking to is Czech. I think they know very well how to distribute electricity, and that it's regulated and at a certain price guarantee form, and that there is a certain factor in terms of industry versus society. I think that's a play that is very strong within Colombia. I think the real benefit of geothermal become as a base load, very similar to hydropower to that degree, as a base load factor, power purchase agreements, long-term planning. These are all extremely well thought out benefits that fits within a regulatory framework as well. I think the most important thing is that we understand costs of geothermal versus the already existing cost base, for instance, hydropower, which Colombia is extremely good in, but also the newcomers coming from wind and solar. And they get auctioned or they get, let's say, sold into the grid for relatively low prices because the technology, the cost reduction profile of solar and wind has done an amazing job over the past 2 decades. And hence, they are going through a regulatory, let's say, framework setting that allows a cost factor of maybe 50% less than geothermal, meaning 5 to 6 cents for wind is quite common, or even lower. For geothermal, we will always be at this point around 8, 9, 10 cents. But we don't need storage, we don't need backup. We are, as we told just now, always on. And a regulatory framework that allows, let's say, high enthalpy, high temperature geothermal resources to be brought on stream for a fixed price guaranteed by the government over, let's say, 20, 30, whatever the lifespan is that people want to plan for, is crucial. And understanding that maybe in the first few years, this cost higher than the others is a benefit that needs to be taken into account when there is basically free energy after the profile as we have it between 5 and 7 years. Because if you look at why Kenya is so, let's say, productive, why El Salvador has a relatively low electricity price for its citizens, It is because of geothermal. It is because we are there for a very long time. But in order to get that regulatory framework right for geothermal, we have to take into account all these, let's say, high capital intensive projects with a slow reward, but then a huge reward, of course, long term. And that's a hard nut to crack within an upcoming market. I give you that.
Oh, quite interesting. I would love some people from the Colombian government to listen to you, Marit. I think there are very useful tips and comments about what you were saying about reducing costs in electricity, and that's something that I think all the countries worldwide are needing right now. How to reduce the cost, how to basically increase the environmental benefits. Yeah. And something that I'm going to ask you right now is how to mix it with the primary energy sources as hydrocarbons, oil and gas, and coal. And basically, I would like to mention that this question about cost that you already answered comes from Carlos Escandón. Carlos, muchas gracias por la pregunta. Creo que Marit ya contestó algo sobre, digamos, sobre la aplicación de el potencial de energía geotérmica y el costo. Creo que es muy relevante lo que acaba de decir Marit. Entonces, muchas gracias por esa pregunta nuevamente. Marit, I'm going to continue with another question about geothermal potentials. And basically, how does geothermal energy mixes with the primary sources of energy, hydrocarbon, gas, coal, etc.? How is the mix, and how can Colombia take advantage of this geothermal energy, plus at the same time coexisting with the primary energy sources?
So I think this is a very good question, and I think we need all the time in the world to really understand this, how geothermal can do this when it doesn't go well, how we can do it better, but also how to explain it better, I guess, to our politicians, to our government leaders, but also to our industrial folks. I guess what I see happening with worldwide, and just to take a few examples, and then we can see how it relates within the Colombia setting. When there is a national grid, I don't think we even have to discuss this point in terms of how it sits alongside a national grid that has multiple sources of energy delivering electricity, so the electron to the grid. And that can be coal-based power plants, can be gas-fired turbines, it can be oil generating, as in diesel on the islands. When there is a bit of a grid type thinking, and when people are being supplied by electricity through a grid, basically, we just need a transmission line, a geothermal power plant, and we hook ourselves up on the grid. So in that phase, it really becomes a play of the utility companies in order to balance the grid and provide, let's say, at cost price, and preferably with some profit, of course, to the utility company, the electricity to the people, to the industry, to that. So I guess within a national base, or maybe even a regional based grid type of thinking, geothermal exists, coexists, can be the only one, can be the third, fourth, fifth supplier. I think it can be really interesting when industry normally taps out electricity from a grid, but now wants to transform and becoming more or less independent when it comes down to reducing fossil fuels, looking after scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and hence having a need to decarbonize its energy system, and hence becomes off-grid or independent or energy secure enough. And this is where geothermal comes in as a very handy, let's say, tool. And at the same time, how you mix that with an existing, let's say, grid, or with an co-producing, let's say, power plant coming from gas and coal or biomass, or whatever the complementary system is. Those are discussions we need to have better, because I think predominantly that we don't do that enough in order to secure geothermal as part of the base load narrative. When it comes down to heating and cooling, I see two things. Infrastructure needs a solid base load, and most of the time that's fossil fuel. Geothermal coexists in many places in the harsher, let's say, environments where the winters are cool and the summers are warm. Geothermal works very well in those peak moments with gas. So there is, in Europe, for instance, heating networks always coexist with gas-based, let's say, peak load providers. In China, it works at the moment such that there is a very limited amount of fossil fuels needed because geothermal is so abundant. They really have, let's say, a 24/7 ability to drive the geothermal heating and cooling demand from the citizens, from these, let's say, huge apartment blocks or from the industry itself, because they just drilled so many geothermal wells. And I guess this is the golden point for geothermal to also understand within an upcoming market. Geothermal can be, one day can be independent. If not, you are coexisting with other types of technologies. But the independence only comes when you drill a lot of wells, because only then you have the, let's say, off-grid opportunity to service the needs of your customers directly. Otherwise, it's coexisting.
Hey, Mary, thank you so much. I think I have asked a question that Julian Lopez was asking you about the economic elements of energy market and the mix with the primary energy sources. I'll continue. Cristobal Fernandez made a question about the relation of the geothermal with hydro and combined cycle, I mean, CapEx and OpEx, which I think in a way you've already answered about the terms of cost. If you like to basically expand on any of this question, go ahead, Mary. And Alexis Garcia is asking about advanced geothermal systems. And he's asking about geothermal restrictions and about if we need a grid nearby to be able to actually to have a geothermal energy project in place. Do we need a grid? Do we need to get a grid in place? That's a good question. So
yeah.
What do you think, Mary?
So a couple of things that I by the way, Julian, it's nice to have you on board. So thanks for the question on the economics, and let's discuss further how that can help develop geothermal within Colombia. On the grid side, look, we have also something called mini grids within geothermal, and I guess this is something that other technologies are developing as well in terms of their narrative. You don't naturally have to be part of the national grid. You can also have a standalone grid and service your direct customers directly. But there is a need to produce the fluids and create or generate electricity and then transmit it towards the user. That's a need. I mean, you need to be somewhere.
Absolutely. Yes.
Where your customers are. So, and we see that for heating and cooling as well. I mean, either it's directly located at the customer site, greenhouses, industry, etc., or you tap into the infrastructure called the piped network and get the heat towards the citizens. And for grids, it goes the same. The only question that I would counter back then is, does it need to be a national grid? And I think where geothermal needs to move into, and that is also part of the drive that we have within the IGA to push this out constantly, is that you don't necessarily have to set up a transmission line all the way to your nearest national grid if you have enough customers around your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 megawatt well. And I guess this is also a very interesting conversation to be had within the Colombia, let's say, setting. Yes, I do believe you can connect to the national grid. I mean, there are projects located very nicely towards the next transmission line and hence the hookup pole and etc. But I bet there are many communities in Colombia that will benefit, as there are many countries in the world that will benefit from off-grid solutions. And hence geothermal becoming much more modular, much more scalable, much more, let's say, focused on not just doing enormous projects, but small scale projects that serves 10,000 of people or maybe 1,000 people and can do such a smart thing in a off-grid, remote island community somewhere high in the jungle. I'm not disposing here my knowledge of Colombia, but I think it is important that we think independently from the national grid, and geothermal can play a role. Solar is playing a huge role there. Wind maybe to a lesser degree, but geothermal definitely should own that discussion.
Awesome, thank you. Well, Alexis, you heard Mary. I think we have a lot more from your questions that I asked. Thank you very much, Mary. We have 2 more questions, and I think we're getting closer to the final questions. we have, I think that is a question from Daniel Girasoli, and we have another question from Ian, and I think I have one more question that will be it. So to keep my promise.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think Danielle has a little bit more background about other projects. She's talking about the possibility of developing a Nereida project, and she's talking about having dry rock here in Colombia, and it would be better to close the loop system like EVOR project or EGS. That would be basically very specific. How would you like to address this question? Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, so this is very good to open up the floor towards an innovation and new types of technology, and I guess a lot of potential already exists in what we call the hydrothermal. Let's say the standard, conventional, whatever the word is that you want to use for the standard way to look at geothermal resources comes from the hydrothermal approach. And to a certain degree, EGS, as in where we're enhancing the geothermal system, is also part of that discussion, because we're doing that in few places of this planet as well, where the hot dry rock, as Daniela is referring to, where there is not necessarily an aquifer that we're tapping into, but where an aquifer is being created in terms of circulating cold water in hot rock, which is an exciting technology, and there's lots of innovation going on. And I guess that's also a political, let's say, discussion, because it involves stimulating the subsurface, and we're not using the F word here, we're using stimulation techniques in order to create flow. I think these are crucial discussions to be had with the public, with our politicians, but also with our technologists, because I think we can do it in a safe and environmental benign way. But I guess these are open discussions still for many countries to be had. The third one is what we call closed loop. And that is an interesting one, because instead of us having two wells that are communicating with each other in a certain way, we have basically a gigantic radiator or a single well radiator that is allowing heat to be conductive through its conductive matter via via, let's say, a radiator type of setting, allowing heat to come at surface. And with heat, you can do many things, as we know. We can do electricity if it's hot enough, or we can do direct heating and cooling. Closed loop is interesting. It is at the moment being looked at, researched, being commercially developed and demonstrated in certain parts of the world. We have high expectations. I think as a technologist myself, I'm keen to see everyone trying whatever they can in order to get geothermal happening. I think for Colombia, there are many places where the new type of technologies can definitely benefit the broadening of the horizon beyond just the hydrothermal approach. But my advice would always be to look at everything, because there is just not enough, let's say, from one side of the coin in order to do it with one type of technology. So my advice would always be to look at every type of geology, every type of aquifer, every type of resource, shallow, deep, ultra deep, whatever it is, but the subsurface yields the answer to a lot of the political commitments, and that is a low carbon environment.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Awesome. We have another question, and this is the final question for the audience. I'm gonna basically have one more question from Asipe to you, and this is a question from Ian, which is an excellent question. Ian Bywot. Basically, he's talking about engaging stakeholders, particularly the community, and his question is, how can they be engaged in order to have successful geothermal energy projects at the initial stage and in the long run? That's an excellent question. That's very relevant. Thank you, Ian.
Yes, Ian, thank you. I know Ian slightly, so thank you, Ian. This is always a thoughtful question, and something that I think we should be talking about worldwide, because it happens worldwide that if we don't include the major shareholder, which is the general public, which are the people who are living, owning, being part of the community of the land that we're using in order to produce geothermal, if we don't include them, neither if they don't see a benefit, as we all know, NIMBY, not in my backyard, is a very emotional sort of kickback that can happen when we're not including our shareholders within the process. How to do that best is also culturally dependent. I mean, there are countries in the world where geothermal is so ingrained in the way of life. Think about Hungary, think about Iceland. Yeah, it's yes, you need to consult people, but it is part of their daily lives, and hence it becomes a different story in terms of how to handle the general public, as opposed to countries where geothermal is completely new and where there is maybe a bit of a let's say hesitance towards drilling inland. Whether that is a hesitance coming from oil and gas experience, or whether there's a hesitance because it's religious. We know of Bali, for instance, in Indonesia, where the people do not want to see any drill bit in the ground because land, and hence the subsurface, is seen as a deity, as a religious item, and hence you will not drill God, basically, and hence it becomes the lay of the land, and hence the cultural imprint of that is super important to understand how to approach, how to deal, and how to generate benefits that are meaningful to the communities with whom we work. And at the same time, I'm also of the belief that we can do a much better job by detailing this out. What are the benefits? Because I can see where wind is picking up speed, wind technology, is where they have created co-shared benefits with the community for whom they are driving these projects for. And if we are not allowing benefits to happen for the communities and the societies at large, then I think we will see a same path where we are being pushed out of, let's say, the community spirit, because what's in it for them? And hence, I think we need to be much more thoughtful and detailing how to create exact benefits and for whom they matter most within all our projects. So great question, and I hope I answered it eloquently enough, Ian.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Appreciate that. I think that's something that we'll have to apply through our communities and basically get that knowledge across to the common public about all the potential of geothermal energy and how we can use it in benefits of the whole community. Thank you so much, Ian, for that question. We have other good questions, but we're running out of time. I'm looking at the list over here, see if somebody new has come in. Excuse me if I'm not looking at all. Basically, I would like to a big hello to Mario Rodriguez, that is with Nancy right now, and I know you know very well about Mario from Petro Seismic. Gracias, Mario, por estar acá con nosotros. We have some other questions that from Pedro and Diana, and unfortunately we're running out of time. But regarding Diana's questions, something that I always ask to our special experts coming to ACIPET for this Café con Energía. We would like to know, Marit, if you want to talk to the youngsters who have just started exploring this field, and to the, I would say not only the youngster, but to the general workforce in Colombia, geologists and petroleum engineers that are looking at this potential energy to be applied in Colombia. What will be your message to engage these youngsters and to engage these professionals from different fields? What is the message of engagement?
So I think in general, the youngsters that are, and also the professionals that are embracing the subsurface as part of their discipline, whether you're a geologist, a reservoir engineer, geophysicist, whatever it is, but you are looking at the subsurface as part of your skill set, as your capabilities. To those, I would say, there is no better time to embrace that skill set because the world needs you. And yes, you can look at it from a negative point of view, is that the world is looking at oil and gas as being negative and fossil fuels are polluting our planet. That's a discussion that needs to be had, and that's part of the transformation phase, and that's part of the transition that we are in. But the skills of the subsurface are needed. They are needed because you have the purpose to deliver on the green energy transition that is taking place left or right. Without geothermal or without subsurface knowledge, I don't think we're getting there in 2050. I really believe that. And hence, there is no better time to pick up, let's say, the battlefield skills and go in there and show the world how subsurface knowledge benefits the green transition. And again, I can't iterate this too much. There is no better place to do that in a changing environment as we are now in. I mean, there is no status quo anymore. We are changing. Geologists are needed, drilling engineers are needed, reservoir engineers are needed, and this is not a dying discipline. This is a growing discipline.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. I think we're coming to the end. Not before coming to the end, saying a big hello to Mauricio Klopatowski. Mao, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, y a la ingeniera Mónica Marín. Espero no haber dejado a nadie por fuera, y si dejé a alguien por fuera del listado de Zoom, me excuso nuevamente, pero muy complacido de tener la audiencia acá por Zoom, y estoy seguro que tenemos una audiencia aún mayor por YouTube. Esta Café con Energía es grabado y será básicamente sacado por redes para que todos escuchemos a Marit en esta gran ocasión que tenemos el Café con Energía y Liderazgo de ACIPET. Marit, I would say that we're looking forward for that paper.
Yes.
We're going to publish this Café con Energía through our website, so maybe we're going to attach a one-on-one paper, a very basic fundamental concepts of the geothermal energy. And I just wanted to tell you once again, thank you very much for being here with us from ACIPET. We also love geothermal. And we are promoters, and this is your home in Colombia as well. I know that you have quite a few people that are following you in Colombia, but count on us, ACIPET, the Colombian Association of Petroleum Engineers, that will be following you, will be promoting geothermal energy in Colombia, and with the help of other engineers, we'll be basically making all what we can do to promote this other source of energy that we'll think that is quite important for Colombia and the world in general. Thank you so much for being with us, Mary.
Such a pleasure. And yes, I consider ACIPET my home in Colombia. So I'll see you soon in the real time. But thanks for having this chat. It was amazing, Luis, the questions that came from the audience. And thank you all for reaching out as well. And yes, to jointly promoting geothermal. This is important for Colombia, for the country, but also for the region and the world. So we need these strong supporters. So Luis, thanks again for the invitation. It was a huge pleasure.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much. Y muchas gracias a todos los ingenieros de petróleos y profesionales afines por estar con nosotros en ACIPET en un café con energía y liderazgo con Mary Brommer, especialista mundial en energía geotérmica. Muchas gracias, Mary. Muchas gracias a todos. Hasta la próxima. Muchas gracias.
Okay, ciao.
Chao.